Good evening. Tonight we examine how a single confrontation in Harlem reshaped community power and legend.
Harlem, New York, 4:19 p.m. Tuesday, July 14, 1959. Late afternoon humidity clings to the pavement as shoppers swarm down West 125th Street. Men in linen shirts wipe sweat from their brows. Women cluster in front of the Apollo marquee, waiting for evening tickets. The smell of roasted peanuts and gasoline mixes into the heavy city air. At the crosswalk in front of Blumstein's department store stands Bumpy Johnson, dressed in a pale blue summer dress and white gloves. She carries 2 paper shopping bags, one for household goods, the other for a silk tie her husband prefers. She waits for the light to change. She is the wife of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's undisputed strategist of respect. A patrol car rolls to a stop at the curb. Out steps Patrolman Harold Kane, a tall, square-jawed officer with a reputation for arrogance and an affinity for showing Harlem that badges outrank dignity. His uniform is crisp. His voice carries the tone of ownership. "Move along, girl," he orders, gesturing with lazy disdain. Mamie does not move. The crosswalk remains red, traffic still flowing. Kane's irritation escalates. He steps closer, invading her space. Several pedestrians pause. The officer repeats himself, slower, louder, each syllable a reminder of the hierarchy he believes governs the street. The light flips green. Mamie begins forward. Kane grabs her arm. She pulls back. Witnesses freeze in anticipation. And then it happens, sudden, sharp, and humiliating. His open palm cracks across her cheek. The sound cuts through the heat like a switchblade. Her shopping bags fall, contents scattering across the street. A silk tie rests on the asphalt, dirtied by tire dust. A small gasp travels through the crowd. The officer smirks, adjusts his belt, and walks back to his vehicle with the casual confidence of a man who expects 0 consequences. He drives off at 4:21 p.m. At 5:03 p.m., Mamie sits silently inside her brownstone apartment. The welt on her cheek burns. She still says nothing. A neighbor calls Bumpy. He arrives at 5:27 p.m. Dressed in a charcoal suit, hat low, tie perfectly knotted, he surveys her face. His jaw remains still. No rage, no raised voice, just silence, the kind that signals calculation, not grief. Bumpy asks only one question, badge number? Mamie whispers it. He nods once. At 6:11 p.m., Bumpy Johnson walks down Lenox Avenue alone. Witnesses note his pacing, steady, measured, almost mechanical. Harlem understands this ritual. There is no shouting, no threats, just math, cause and consequence. By sunrise, the officer who slapped Mamie Johnson will understand that disrespect carries a price. And within days, the entire precinct will learn that Harlem's hierarchy is not written in law books, but in the currency of respect and retaliation. The story of how Patrolman Harold Kane lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now let's go back to July 14th, 1959. The morning had started like any other in Harlem. Street vendors hawked hot dogs and pretzels. The rumble of elevated trains punctuated conversations on the sidewalks, and children played stickball between parked cars. By early afternoon, the air was heavy with heat and exhaust, the sun baking the brick facades of brownstones and storefronts alike. Mamie Johnson, poised and graceful even in the sweltering heat, had stepped out to run errands. She carried herself with quiet confidence, the kind earned by association with a man whose reputation preceded him on every block. At precisely 4:19 p.m., she reached the crosswalk in front of Blumstein's department store. Her hands, gloved in crisp white cotton, clutched 2 paper bags. One held a freshly laundered linen blouse, the other a silk tie Bumpy favored for his evening engagements. The light hung stubbornly red. Pedestrians shifted impatiently around her, but Mamie's attention was singular. The world around her seemed to slow as a sleek black patrol car rolled to the curb, tires kicking up dust and asphalt. Patrolman Harold Kane stepped out, the uniform crisp, the star polished, the leather belt tight. His reputation in Harlem was well known. A man who wielded authority like a weapon, who believed that a badge erased every boundary, every limit, every shred of human decency. His eyes scanned the street, settling on Mamie with the precision of a predator. "Move along, girl," he barked, the words dripping with condescension. The crowd hesitated. A few onlookers froze mid-step, sensing the imminent collision of arrogance and consequence. Mamie did not flinch. She waited for the light. Kane's patience frayed visibly, his jaw clenched, fingers tapping the car roof. A cruel smirk formed on his face as he stepped forward, towering over her small frame. "I said, move along!" His hand shot out, palm open. The crack of impact echoed through the crosswalk, cutting sharper than the summer heat. Mamie staggered, lips parted, a faint gasp slipping past, and the shopping bags tumbled to the asphalt. A silk tie rolled beneath a passing taxi, already beginning its transformation from luxury to refuse. The crowd erupted in whispers and murmurs, some stepping closer, others retreating, instinctively aware that the act was personal, not procedural. Kane straightened, adjusting his belt, his expression smug. He returned to his vehicle as though nothing had happened, the casual confidence of a man who assumed respect was mandatory. 4:21 p.m. 2 minutes later, he drove off, leaving the scattered remnants of Mamie's afternoon in his wake. Inside her brownstone apartment at 5:03 p.m., Mamie sat silently. The welt on her cheek pulsed with heat, yet no words of anger escaped her lips. A neighbor's hushed voice dialed Bumpy. Within minutes, the man himself arrived, dressed in a charcoal suit that absorbed the light but reflected none of it. Hat low, tie straight, his gaze swept over Mamie's face. Silence. Not one syllable, not a single exclamation. The room trembled under the weight of his calm, the kind of calm that promised methodical, inevitable consequences. Bumpy spoke once, quietly. "Badge number?" The number whispered to him carried the power of a verdict. He nodded once, the only acknowledgement needed. 5:27 p.m., Harlem's most feared enforcer began walking down Lenox Avenue, unaccompanied. Pacing was steady, deliberate, almost ritualistic. No threats, no shouts, just observation and calculation. The streets, the vendors, the children, even the idle men on stoops understood the gravity of his silence. Cause and effect were being tallied. The clock was already ticking. By the time night descended, whispers spread through Harlem. Patrons at the corner bar debated the audacity of Kane, while mothers pulled children closer on sidewalks. The story of the slap traveled faster than the trains above the streets. Each retelling added tension. Each pause built dread. And somewhere in the shadows, Bumpy was already drafting the method, the sequence, the precision of punishment. The chapter closes with the reader knowing that history is about to witness a lesson in respect enforced not by law, but by the cold, unstoppable arithmetic of Harlem's protector. Every second from the slap until the next sunrise would bring Kane closer to understanding that nothing in Harlem, no badge, no title, no reputation, exempts a man from the consequences of humiliating Bumpy Johnson's family. The morning after the slap, Patrolman Harold Kane awoke in his small apartment above a dry-cleaning shop on 7th Avenue. Sunlight filtered through partially closed blinds, casting thin stripes across his uniform pressed neatly on a chair. He sipped black coffee, the taste bitter yet familiar. Yesterday's act, the slap, the humiliation, the scattered shopping bags, had barely registered in his mind. In his world, authority demanded obedience. Respect was assumed, not earned. Harlem was a backdrop to his ego, not a stage for consequence. Kane had built his career on this arrogance. Transfers, commendations, disciplinary write-ups, they mattered little. He carried the badge like a shield and a weapon, never questioning that the law itself bent in his favor. His colleagues whispered about him in precinct hallways, reckless, volatile, intolerant of defiance, yet strangely charming when it suited him. He thrived on that duality, straddling brutality and charisma, a man who could intimidate, but also ingratiate, if it meant keeping power intact. By 10:14 a.m., Kane was already on patrol. Harlem, usually a labyrinth of rhythm and movement, seemed slower today, as if the streets themselves sensed the tension rolling beneath the surface. Kane passed by 125th Street, where Mamie had been slapped. The memory of her pale blue dress, the fallen silk tie, and the faintly trembling gasp of witnesses never crossed his mind as a warning, only as a footnote, a minor inconvenience. His first stop was Benny's bar on Lenox Avenue. Kane leaned against the polished wood, scanning the room. Bartender polished glasses with deliberate care. Local gamblers nursed drags of cheap whiskey. Kane laughed with ease, recounting the incident as if telling a joke. "She should have moved," he said, tapping the bar with a thick finger. "I'm the law, that's all there is to it." The patrons nodded, some politely, some nervously, but the message was clear. Kane's confidence remained unshaken. The slap had been the climax, and he assumed the audience already on his side. Behind the laughter, Kane carried another burden, his personal weaknesses. Gambling debts had begun to accumulate in recent months, threatening his reputation and finances. A mistress awaited at an apartment 3 blocks from the precinct. Both, he believed, were manageable risks, private indulgences, controllable exposures. He had no reason to suspect that anyone in Harlem, particularly someone like Bumpy Johnson, could manipulate these vulnerabilities with systematic precision. By 3:52 p.m., Kane returned to the precinct. The captain handed him a routine ticket book without so much as a glance at his blotched record or previous complaints about brutality. Kane pocketed it, nodding curtly. The precinct had long tolerated his arrogance. Discipline was a formality, never a threat. He assumed it would continue uninterrupted. But then, at 4:37 p.m., Kane received an envelope slipped under his apartment door. No return address, no signature, only a single line scrawled in precise, deliberate handwriting. "You crossed the wrong line." 48 hours. The paper burned a hole through his confidence. The room felt suddenly smaller, shadows longer. Kane's first inkling of danger was a whisper, a pulse in the gut. He laughed it off, convincing himself it was a prank. Yet the words lingered. Bumpy Johnson's name was not written, but it needed no introduction in Harlem. Every ear in every corner had already whispered it. By 8 p.m., Kane was at his mistress's apartment, confident, charming, unaware. The night seemed to stretch in slow motion, each footstep outside his door echoing like a countdown he refused to hear. Harlem's streets, normally lively and accommodating, became a landscape of potential threats, though Kane remained blind. The chapter ends with Kane drifting to sleep later that night, his arrogance intact, unaware that within hours, Bumpy's methodical surveillance and precise orchestration would begin dismantling his world. By sunrise, Kane's confidence would be the first casualty, yet he would not know who delivered the first strike until it was far too late. Midnight in Harlem. The streets were quiet, but the air was thick with anticipation. The elevated trains rattled overhead, their echoes bouncing off brick facades. But the real sound was silence. The kind that warns of something brewing beneath the surface. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in a small back room above a bar on Lenox Avenue, smoke curling from a half-burned cigar, the faint smell of stale whiskey and paper lingering in the air. Around him, his trusted lieutenants leaned forward in low chairs, faces shadowed, eyes sharp. No one spoke until he spoke, and when he did, every word landed like a stone on water. Bumpy recounted the day's events, the slap, the humiliation, the audacity of a badge-wielding man thinking Harlem was a playground for his cruelty. He did not shout. He did not gesticulate. He paused, taking a deliberate drag of his cigar, exhaling slowly, letting the smoke curl into the corners of the room. Silence filled the gaps between words. That silence was itself a warning. His lieutenants understood. It was time to act, but action required precision. The first step, intelligence. Bumpy had to know every detail about Kane, the habits, the vulnerabilities, the points where arrogance could be pierced. He instructed his network of Harlem youth, the streetwise boys who ran messages, watched bars, and memorized every alleyway, to begin surveillance. Every hour of Kane's day, every purchase, every phone call, every late-night rendezvous had to be logged. Names, addresses, debts owed, enemies, allies, all became part of a mental map Bumpy was drawing with meticulous care. The second step, exploitation. Kane's personal vices were already known to Bumpy. Gambling debts were ripe for pressure. His mistress's apartment offered leverage. Even his vanity, the polished shoes, the well-kept uniform, the carefully combed hair, would become tools in a strategy that would humiliate and unbalance him before any physical confrontation occurred. The plan was never brute force first. It was always humiliation first, precision second. Smart violence, systematic consequences. By 1:12 a.m., reports began arriving. Kane's mistress had been seen leaving a building near 110th Street. His bookie had been spotted demanding payment with urgency. Every detail fed into Bumpy's ledger, invisible to the law, but perfectly clear to the enforcers of Harlem respect. He traced Kane's evening bar stops, noting every bartender, every fellow officer, every pedestrian who could be unwitting witnesses or pawns. Bumpy's mind worked like a chessboard, every piece positioned, every move predictable, every risk accounted for. By 2:46 a.m., a critical piece fell into place. Kane had made himself vulnerable by underestimating the city he patrolled. A shipment of gambling debts was due, a scheduled meeting with the mistress was imminent, and the officer had shown no awareness of the network silently watching his every step. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady, almost bored, as if the pieces had always been arranged this way, and he had only waited for the right time to move. The third step, messaging. Bumpy insisted on notes, anonymous, precise, clear in intent. The first message slipped to Kane's mistress, photographed and sent to him indirectly. A single line, never threatening, always factual. He who disrespects family pays in kind. These notes were not whispers, they were echoes that spread dread. By dawn, Kane would feel it, even if he did not yet see it. By 3:33 a.m., the back room was quiet again. Bumpy's lieutenants filed out, each assigned roles, monitoring, documenting, subtly nudging Kane toward his own unraveling. Every clock tick brought them closer to the moment when humiliation would precede physical consequence. Every detail gathered was a nail in the coffin of Kane's arrogance. The chapter closes with Bumpy sitting alone, cigar stub in ashtray, the city breathing quietly around him. Harlem slept, oblivious to the methodical orchestration unfolding in the shadows. The officer had no idea that his every move was now a thread in a tapestry of calculated retribution. Smart violence was coming, and by morning, Kane's life would begin to fracture in ways his badge could never protect. Dawn had not yet broken over Harlem, but the city already carried a different weight. The streets, usually alive with vendors and children, seemed to hold their breath, as if sensing the inevitability of what was coming. Patrolman Harold Kane awoke that morning with a slight unease. A whisper of something out of place tugged at the edges of his mind, but he dismissed it. Confidence had always been his armor, and arrogance his shield. He would need both. By 9:08 a.m., Kane's first alarm arrived, not in person, not with threats, but on paper. A single photograph slipped under the door of his mistress's apartment, him clearly identified leaving the precinct the day before, his arrogance on display. Beneath the photograph, in neat, precise handwriting, one sentence: "The law does not protect you here." Kane stared at it, the coffee trembling in his hand. Something cold brushed along his spine, yet he tried to laugh it off, convincing himself it was a prank. By mid-morning, Bumpy's strategy unfolded in meticulous stages. First, the bookie. Kane had debts long overdue, and Harlem's enforcers had ways of accelerating payment with subtle, undeniable force. At 10:42 a.m., a courier delivered an anonymous note to the bookie: "Pay today, or your next client will have consequences." You know who enforces respect. By 11:30 a.m., the bookie called Kane personally, demanding immediate settlement. Kane's fingers itched at the phone, but the deeper humiliation began to sink in. The network of Harlem had encircled him, unseen but undeniable. At noon, Bumpy's lieutenants turned their attention to Kane's public image. His prized car, a gleaming sedan he often flaunted along Lenox Avenue, had been vandalized overnight. Paint scratched along the side spelled out in bold letters, "Respect is earned." The tires slashed. Kane arrived at work and froze. This was no ordinary act of vandalism. This was targeted, deliberate, personal. The first public cracks in his armor began to form, and whispers spread through the precinct. Even his colleagues began to notice the subtle shift, the once confident officer now jittery, defensive, on edge. By 2:17 p.m., Kane's mistress received another anonymous delivery, a photograph of her with Kane distributed to her neighbors, a silent warning of exposure. Kane's personal life, meticulously separated from his professional identity, began to collapse. Every move he made, walking down Lenox, entering the precinct, buying lunch, was now potentially visible to someone in Bumpy's network. The final stage before direct action was psychological. By 4:05 p.m., Kane's gambling partner was found beaten outside a rundown pool hall, a note pinned to his shirt, "One down." The message was clear. Consequences were real, inevitable, systematic. Kane, for the first time, understood the magnitude of what he faced. Bumpy Johnson was not a man who reacted in rage. He orchestrated in silence, calculating every step until the target was broken. By evening, Kane had attempted to fortify himself. Doors locked, guns checked, and calls made to precinct colleagues for backup, but it was futile. Every connection he believed he had proved unreliable. The network Bumpy had built, silent and invisible, ensured that Kane's fortress was permeable at every point. The chapter closes with Kane sitting alone in his apartment, staring at the ceiling. Fear, a feeling unfamiliar and unwelcome, began to take root. He understood he had underestimated Harlem, underestimated Bumpy, and underestimated the precision of calculated retaliation. By the next night, humiliation would be paired with pain, and the officer who once struck without consequence would finally pay, piece by piece, in ways that left no room for recovery. The night was thick, nearly tangible, as Harlem exhaled a tense, expectant breath. Streetlights cast long, fractured shadows across the pavement. At 2:14 a.m., Patrolman Harold Kane left the bar on Lenox Avenue, his gait unsteady but controlled, unaware that every step was being tracked with deliberate precision. He had fortified himself with whiskey and false confidence, convincing himself that the threats and humiliations were mere coincidences, tricks of the city's chaos. But the truth, Harlem's truth, was precise, systematic, and unstoppable. Bumpy Johnson watched from a shadowed stoop several blocks away, hat low, cigar smoldering in hand. He was alone, calm, immovable, and his gaze never wavered from the target. Time was measured, not in minutes, but in the moments needed for execution. 2:21 a.m. Kane's footsteps echoed off the brick walls. 2:27 a.m. He fumbled with his car keys, the note he had received weeks earlier still in his pocket, unread. 2:31 a.m. Bumpy took one step forward, signaling his lieutenants to spread across the surrounding blocks. Every exit Kane might take was covered. Every alley, every doorway, every witness accounted for. Bumpy approached silently, the city's murmur a dull background to the storm about to descend. Kane, confident in his own authority, barely registered the shadow until it was beside him. "Evening, officer," Bumpy said calmly, voice low, devoid of emotion. His eyes locked on Kane's, steady, unyielding, a mirror reflecting inevitability. No threats, no shouting, just a statement of fact. The calm before the storm was deliberate, a psychological dagger piercing Kane's arrogance. Bumpy reached into his coat, producing a small note. He pressed it into Kane's palm. Kane glanced down. Harlem protects its own. 3 words, each one carrying the weight of calculated wrath, enough to make a man understand his vulnerability. Kane's fingers trembled, and for the first time he realized that his badge, his rank, his years of law enforcement meant nothing here. The physical consequence was precise, measured, and brutal. Bumpy's hands, steady and deliberate, executed the punishment that matched the insult. 2 broken fingers, one for the slap across Mamie's face, the other for the racial epithet he had muttered that day, years of arrogance condensed into calculated pain. Each snap of bone, deliberate and controlled, was a lesson in respect, a message encoded in suffering. Kane's protests were weak, disbelieving, his body failing to comprehend that this was not rage. It was justice, methodical and inevitable. By 2:52 a.m. the act was complete. Bumpy withdrew, leaving Kane propped against a brick wall, clutching his ruined hand, the note still pressing a silent ultimatum into his chest. Harlem's streets returned to their quiet rhythm, but the lesson lingered. Kane had been humiliated, physically broken, and publicly exposed. The network of Bumpy's lieutenants ensured the story spread swiftly. No one in Harlem would forget that the officer who disrespected Bumpy's family had paid the price. Within 72 hours. Kane's world unraveled completely. His mistress disappeared, fearing exposure. The bookie demanded immediate repayment, and every colleague who once admired his arrogance now viewed him as fragile, compromised, a cautionary tale. The precinct unofficially whispered a truce. No one would intervene. No one would question. Respect had been enforced, and the streets had taken note. The chapter closes with Kane fleeing Harlem, broken in body and spirit, while Bumpy stands alone on Lenox Avenue, hat low, cigar stub in ashtray, surveying a city he protects not through law, but through the systematic application of respect, silence, and precise, brutal consequences. By the time dawn broke, Harlem understood once more that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not just a man, but a law unto himself. The night was thick, nearly tangible, as Harlem exhaled a tense, expectant breath. Streetlights cast long, fractured shadows across the pavement. At 2:14 a.m., Patrolman Harold Kane left the bar on Lenox Avenue, his gait unsteady but controlled, unaware that every step was being tracked with deliberate precision. He had fortified himself with whiskey and false confidence, convincing himself that the threats and humiliations were mere coincidences, tricks of the city's chaos. But the truth, Harlem's truth, was precise, systematic, and unstoppable. Bumpy Johnson watched from a shadowed stoop several blocks away, hat low, cigar smoldering in hand. He was alone, calm, immovable, and his gaze never wavered from the target. Time was measured, not in minutes, but in the moments needed for execution. 2:21 a.m. Kane's footsteps echoed off the brick walls. 2:27 a.m. He fumbled with his car keys, the note he had received weeks earlier still in his pocket, unread. 2:31 a.m. Bumpy took one step forward, signaling his lieutenants to spread across the surrounding blocks. Every exit Kane might take was covered, every alley, every doorway, every witness accounted for. Bumpy approached silently, the city's murmur a dull background to the storm about to descend. Kane, confident in his own authority, barely registered the shadow until it was beside him. "Evening, officer," Bumpy said calmly, voice low, devoid of emotion. His eyes locked on Kane's, steady, unyielding, a mirror reflecting inevitability. No threats, no shouting. Just a statement of fact. The calm before the storm was deliberate, a psychological dagger piercing Kane's arrogance. Bumpy reached into his coat, producing a small note. He pressed it into Kane's palm. Kane glanced down. Harlem protects its own. 3 words, each one carrying the weight of calculated wrath, enough to make a man understand his vulnerability. Kane's fingers trembled, and for the first time he realized that his badge, his rank, his years of law enforcement meant nothing here. The physical consequence was precise, measured, and brutal. Bumpy's hands, steady and deliberate, executed the punishment that matched the insult. 2 broken fingers, one for the slap across Mamie's face, the other for the racial epithet he had muttered that day. Years of arrogance condensed into calculated pain. Each snap of bone, deliberate and controlled, was a lesson in respect, a message encoded in suffering. Kane's protests were weak, disbelieving, his body failing to comprehend that this was not rage, it was justice, methodical, and inevitable. By 2:52 a.m., the act was complete. Bumpy withdrew, leaving Kane propped against a brick wall, clutching his ruined hand, the note still pressing a silent ultimatum into his chest. Harlem's streets returned to their quiet rhythm, but the lesson lingered. Kane had been humiliated, physically broken, and publicly exposed. The network of Bumpy's lieutenants ensured the story spread swiftly. No one in Harlem would forget that the officer who disrespected Bumpy's family had paid the price. Within 72 hours, Kane's world unraveled completely. His mistress disappeared, fearing exposure. The bookie demanded immediate repayment, and every colleague who once admired his arrogance now viewed him as fragile, compromised, a cautionary tale. The precinct unofficially whispered a truce. No one would intervene, no one would question. Respect had been enforced, and the streets had taken note. The chapter closes with Kane fleeing Harlem, broken in body and spirit, while Bumpy stands alone on Lenox Avenue, hat low, cigar stub in ashtray, surveying a city he protects not through law, but through the systematic application of respect, silence, and precise, brutal consequences. By the time dawn broke, Harlem understood once more that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not just a man, but a law unto himself. By the early hours of morning, Harlem stirred, carrying with it a heavy, unspoken reverence. The streets smelled of fresh bread from corner bakeries and the faint, acrid smoke of last night's subways. News of Kane's ruin traveled faster than the elevated trains rattling overhead. Not through newspapers, not through official channels. This was whispered law, carried in the cadence of street talk, passed from stoop to stoop, corner to corner. Harlem knew when respect had been enforced, and the name at the center of it was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The community's response was quiet but unanimous. Shopkeepers who had once ducked under Kane's glare now nodded in silent approval when Bumpy passed. Mothers no longer feared the shadow of a uniform over their children. Harlem had witnessed not mere retribution, but a lesson delivered with precision, discipline, and inevitability. The public humiliation of a police officer, his mistress gone, debts collected with lethal efficiency, broken fingers as testament, was a stark reminder. No man, regardless of badge or title, could touch Bumpy Johnson's family without consequence. Within the precinct, the effect was seismic. Officers whispered behind closed doors, tradesmen discussed Kane's flight in hushed tones, and a delicate truce formed without a single word. The man who had once commanded authority with arrogance now existed as a cautionary tale. His desk remained empty, his badge suspended, and the files he once oversaw untouched. The captain, pragmatic and wary, understood the unspoken rules. Harlem had its enforcer, and law had limits where Bumpy operated. Bumpy himself returned to his routine as if nothing had occurred. He walked Lenox Avenue with his usual calm, hat low, cigar smoldering. To an untrained eye, he was a man on the street. To Harlem, he was a law, a guardian, a force of nature that measured respect in action, not words. Mamie, seated in her brownstone, removed the faint remnants of the welt from her cheek, a subtle victory of dignity restored. In her eyes, Bumpy was not merely her husband. He was the embodiment of protection and unyielding justice. The officer's downfall became legend, whispered in bars, barber shops, and pool halls for decades to come. Young men on the street learned early that disrespect carried a price far beyond the scope of legal punishment. Kane's story was repeated as an example, each retelling emphasizing not brutality alone, but the methodical orchestration, the intelligence behind the punishment, and the unshakable calm of the man who delivered it. Notes left, debts enforced, reputations shattered. These became the language of respect in Harlem, a dialect understood by everyone, feared by all who might challenge it. The chapter closes with Harlem's skyline at twilight, the streets bathed in orange and violet. Bumpy Johnson's presence is felt everywhere, not in visible patrols, but in the unspoken order of the streets, the deference of those who understood the cost of crossing him. History would try to ignore, sanitize, or diminish these events, but the legacy was carved into the very fabric of the city. Respect, once earned through fear and precision, became legend, and as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Harlem knew this truth. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not just survive history, he commanded it.